So he found a role really as the good Nazi. So he became the go-to for documentary makers and historians and everyone else who wanted someone as a talking head who had been at the top table in Nazi Germany.
It's an extraordinary, extraordinary piece of writing, actually. It's incredibly mendacious, but it's also so incredibly well written and stylish and slippery. So, Roger Moorhouse, my fellow history book buff, in today's episode, we have decided to look at two mendacious memoirs, and we have got some brilliantly, horribly toe-raggy lying memoirs for us to look at today. Now, which one is yours?
I'm doing Albert Speer's Inside the Third Reich, so one of the great memoirs from that period, famously now seen as mendacious. What's yours? What's your choice?
My choice is Kim Philby's My Silent War, which is, well, we will talk about it, but an extraordinary piece of writing. So, Roger, why don't you kick us off and tell us about Speer's memoir?
Yeah, so Albert Speer's memoir, Inside the Third Reich, was published in 1970. So Speer had been one of Hitler's pet architects during the Third Reich, had been responsible for a number of at least prominent designs, if not a few finished buildings, and then later became Minister of Armaments, most famously, kind of really reorganized the German armament system in the latter couple of years of the war. Was tried at Nuremberg, was given 20 years at Nuremberg, so came out of prison in 1966. Most of the material for the memoir he'd already written down in the first sort of 10 years of his incarceration. So it's reasonably fresh by the time he actually pulls it all together into the memoir Inside the Third Reich. And it sort of propelled him, really. He was became one of the big celebrities, I suppose, of that period. He was a great talking head. He spoke decent English, so he was very, perfect for the Western world. So he appeared on things like The World at War, famously, one of the talking heads on that. And another, famously as well, the Playboy interview that he did in the 1970s, So he found a role really as the good Nazi. So he became the go-to for, documentary makers and historians and everyone else who wanted someone as a talking head who had been at the top table in Nazi Germany. He filled that role, and he filled it very well. Effectively the last 10 years of his life.
But so people, you think, needed someone, because obviously you want insight into, what Nazism was and represented. But obviously you're too squeamish to go to the people that you think are very, very implicated in the
Yeah.
crimes. So you're saying it effectively suited everybody for Speer to be a sort of outsider on the inside. So it meant that he was the palatable way to get access.
Yeah, exactly that. And as I said, he spoke English, so that sort of helped. That helped with the whole, the packaging of him. And crucially, he had created this. I mean, he was quite a sort of urbane and cultured man. He was an architect already. Hitched his wagon to Nazi Germany. He portrayed himself crucially. So this wasn't like a sort of a post facto invention completely, as in who he was. He portrayed himself at Nuremberg, crucially, in the Nuremberg trial, in contrast to a lot of the other defendants, many of whom were sort of old-fashioned street politicians. Think of someone like Julius Streicher, who was very crude and frankly insane. Speer sort of stood on the witness stand, or as a defendant, though, rather, and expressed contrition and essentially portrayed himself as, cut of the same cloth as the judges, right? I'm like you. I just got caught up in this whole crazy whirl of the Third Reich. I'm like you. I'm cultured. I'm urbane. I can see the world for what it is. So he became that guy. That's how he sort of portrayed himself, and it wasn't a million miles away from who he was. But it was a creation, and he went big on that creation after his memoir came out and after he's released from prison. And as you say, it met a need. We wanted someone who would play that role.
So in the memoir, where does it kind of go to and from, or from and to rather? Like, does it take us right through his early days as a kind of ideologue? What's the kind of narrative meat of it?
Yeah, I mean, it starts really with his early life, and it tells his seduction by Nazism. He talks about going and seeing a Hitler speech, where he found it fascinating, and suddenly was into that world, and wanted to go to another one and wanted to hear it again, and how he sort of fell into that world. Uh, um, First of all, as architect, he became one of the sort of court architects of the Third Reich, and then later on as Minister for Armaments. And he goes into a lot of detail of that world that he was in, and then later, of course, with his being tried at Nuremberg and subsequently. So it does sort of show all of that experience that he had, but at the same time with some serious omissions and some serious obfuscations as well.
Yeah, let's talk about those.
Yeah, so one of the most crucial ones. I mean, he as head of the German armaments push, from 43 to 45, where they really switched to sort of total war. Effectively, they hadn't really been prosecuting total war in terms of a fully aligned economy. He pushed that very, very hard, and he was very effective at it. But as such, he had control of, effectively the forced laborers in Germany. A lot of the slave laborers in concentration camps were pressed into labor and so on. So, he would have intimately involved with all of that. And yet, he essentially kind of washed his hands of it and said, well, I didn't know that, we would, using people in this way, that it was as abusive as it was. His deputy actually was hanged, a guy called Fritz Saukel. So he was hanged at Nuremberg because, like I said before, he didn't really play Nuremberg in the way that Speer did. Speer, played it brilliantly. So that was one of the sort of most crucial ones. He also denied any knowledge of the Holocaust. So on the stand at Nuremberg, he admitted to a collective moral responsibility for what had happened, but he said, I didn't know that the Holocaust was going on. And this the benefit of hindsight and the work of a lot of historians. This has to be nonsense. He must have been, we know he was at various meetings where the Holocaust is discussed, so it's impossible that he can't have known, right? He also expressed what he described this sort of moral opposition to Hitler in the last years of the war, that he felt that he was kind of revolted by Hitler, where he had been very admiring of that man. Then later on, he has this moment. He talks about having a nervous breakdown, which we think is probably true. But when he comes back from the nervous breakdown, he talks about having this sort of moral revulsion against everything that the Nazis stood for, and then subsequently kind of doing some bits of resistance. So resisting against the Nero order, which was an order given to sort of destroy the German military capacity and civil capacity as well, infrastructure and so on. So he claims to have tried to frustrate the Nero order. He claims to have had sympathy with the Stauffenberg assassination attempt. And all of that in retrospect looks rather dodgy.
Well, I mean, even if he did do those things, it's perfectly possible he did those things because it was becoming obvious that Hitler was going to lose the war, and he was a clever enough man to be thinking about his retrospective story.
Yeah.
And, so the moral revulsion angle doesn't even have to be true for it also to be true that he was trying to frustrate things like the Nero order, right?
That's true, but then I think part of the problem with this, I mean, the Nero order is March 45, so it's very, very late. I think part of the problem with this is that, Speer knows, by the time that he's talking about this stuff in his memoirs and so on later on, he knows that most of the people that he's talking about in those memoirs are already dead. They either didn't survive the end of the war, like Hitler himself, or they died in the interim, or they were executed at Nuremberg. So there's very, very few people that can actually contradict him from a position of knowledge. So he can kind of make his own narrative, and he knows that. So yeah, you're right. He could have been trying to create, I suppose, give himself a position at the end of the war where he can make himself look good to the Allies. He could have been that clever, but he's still risking his life by doing it, potentially. So it's still very much up in the air as to precisely what his motives are, whether it is entirely kind of fabricated and post facto imagined history, or whether, he was thinking this at the time. I need to position myself better. Maybe I need to lay a sort of a breadcrumb trail that subsequent war investigators can discover for me. So it's still not entirely clear, but that is certainly the narrative that he pushes.
And contrition,
Yeah.
how far does he say sorry and how far does he mean sorry?
Yeah, well, as I said, he talked about being part of a collective moral responsibility for the crimes of Nazism, but at the same time, excuse me, but at the same time denying that he had any knowledge, particularly of the Holocaust, for example. So again, it's all phrased and curated. The narrative line that he gives is curated very carefully to make him look good, in the sense that he's saying, it was a bad time, and but at the same time, I didn't know about the Holocaust. So no personal responsibility is kind of admitted at all. So he's very clever in the way that he positions himself.
And the impact that it had. So do you
Yeah.
think he succeeded in his aim of kind of, making people trust him as the good Nazi?
I do, actually. I mean, he died in 1981 in London. So, he had 15 years of freedom at the end, freedom released in 1966. So, and they, for him, were good years, right? So, he traveled the world. He was that talking head. He was, paid a lot of money for his book and for, lecture tours and appearances and all the rest of it. So he fitted into that role very, very effectively, and it served him very well. Now, I mean, there's always a question with these things, the extent to which the individual actually believes that they are that person. Because if you create that narrative to some extent, some extent you believe it yourself, right? I mean, that's kind of natural. But that was the narrative he created, and it served him extremely well. And really, it was only really chipped away at. The first book actually comes out in the 1980s by a German historian. But really, it was probably until the turn of the millennium, I would say, or the turn of the century, where, but at which point people are really kind of waking up to, actually, there's quite a lot that just doesn't smell right about Speer. He still gets used. I mean, Inside the Third Reich, very well written, very insightful in many ways, but certainly the character studies and so on are very good. But it was used in good faith for years, and arguably still is. So, it's a very interesting example. You just using it now, you just have to really have your wits about you, and always question, why is he saying that? Is he trying to exculpate himself?
I think we'll come back to, this issue of how you use these memoirs as a writer, because I think that's central
Yeah.
to how we approach them.
Yes.
Yeah.
So do you want to talk about excuse me, Kim Philby's memoir now? Tell us about that.
Yes.
What's the origin of that?
So Kim Philby, it was published in 1968. He'd been in Russia for 7 years. According to his version of accounts, he'd written it sort of over a number of years and was kind of sitting on it. And it was only because the Sunday Times was about to publish a load of kind of explosive articles about him that he decided that he should publish it to correct the errors and the inconsistencies of the Sunday Times story. And it's an extraordinary piece of writing, actually. It's incredibly mendacious, but it's also so incredibly well written and stylish and slippery and beautifully done. And the kind of character he creates of himself as this sort of principled but raffish kind of, swashbuckler is just extraordinary. The other thing that is, of course, absolutely central to approaching the memoir is that it was KGB sanctioned. So there's nothing in there that the KGB did not want to be public. There's nothing in there that the KGB weren't fully, versed on. He had very close minding when he was in the Soviet Union. So
that would suggest it's much more style over substance then. There must be huge omissions.
like the omissions are legion. So for a start, it says almost nothing about what he was doing for the Soviets. The main thrust of all of it is what he was doing for the British, right? So, you know, it offers an insight into his role, into what was going on in British intelligence during the war and where he was then and what was happening with SIS and, you know, a little bit after. It does sort of refer to the moments where he's perpetrating his betrayals, but it's always very sort of understated. It's all sort of slightly slippery. So I'll just give you an example. Right at the end of his time as an effective Soviet agent, which is just before Burgess and McLean defect. So they defect on the 25th of May. At the end of May, on the 14th of May, 16 Ukrainians take off from an airport in Cyprus. Now, I managed to track them down, right? I managed to find all the accounts of this operation in the CIA archives, because obviously we can't find anything in the British SIS archives. They're closed. So Philby says in his autobiography, in his memoir, that he betrays this mission. And he says, I don't know what happened to them, but I can guess. And that's it. That's it. That's, you know, that's all he gives us. This, like, I don't really know what happened to these guys. I don't, you know, I can guess. So, I mean, I know what happened to them. 3 missions, 3 groups of men, 16 in total, were parachuted into the borderlands between Ukraine and Poland. One team was basically captured and killed immediately. Another team was captured and almost certainly turned by the Soviets, who used them to play a game with Western intelligence. They started sending messages back in code. And my researches into these radio games showed that the men who were forced to do this were humiliated and suicidal and shamed and often tortured into doing it. So that was one group. And then the third group were not captured immediately. They were, for the next 6 weeks, hunted through the forests of Western Ukraine, hunted down by the secret police. And when they were found, they were kind of mutilated, and the local villagers were paraded in front of their bodies to be shown what betrayal looked like.
Wow.
Right, so that's what happens. And what you get in Philby's autobiography is that kind of slightly slippery, I can guess what happened to them.
I mean, presumably he doesn't care what happened, because he positions himself as a, you know, principled anti-fascist. So to him, they're fascists, right? So he doesn't care.
Well, especially these guys. There's actually a really interesting backstory to the Ukrainians, is because the British and the Americans both had missions sending Ukrainians across into the Soviet Union, and the Americans were cross with the British because we used members of the Galicia division, the SS division, right? So Banderites, effectively, who were implicated in fascists and Nazi crimes. And that does makes it more complicated, right? Because then it's not necessarily a narrative of straight goods versus straight evil.
Yeah.
But some of these young men who were on these British missions were so young. So, like, there's one I follow in the mission, and he was 22, 1951. So when the Galicia division was formed in 1943, he was a child. So do we blame that child for being almost certainly an orphan, one way or another, because a lot of them were, because, you know, their families have been wiped out by decolonization, by famine, by the war, you know, so I'm not, so the point is, the very strong point is, we have no idea what the political affiliations of the boys who were thrown out of that aeroplane were. Neither did Philby. The difference is we care, he didn't. Right? If you're not explicitly pro-Soviet, you're a fascist. That's how it works in that worldview. So that's the kind of, that's how the memoir goes. There are so many holes, and there's lots of stylish kind of irony and self-deprecation and sort of jokes and
but this kind of,
you know,
this highlight what you've just described, it highlights this myopia when we're talking about the Cambridge Five, and I know your book is trying to redress that, but it's myopia where, you know, we, particularly in Britain, you know, see it as a sort of a class, you know, chumocracy story, and we've completely forgotten about the actual victims of those operations and those betrayals, which you've just described, you know, so well, and the thousands more. But that's just not part of the narrative at all. Now, I mean, I can, you know, there's kind of a navel-gazing, kind of self-obsessed, self-referential bit about why we, you know, perpetuate that narrative of it being a class issue and nothing else. But how much do you think, Philby's memoir was actually instrumental in creating that narrative, in pushing the narrative on the Cambridge Five in that particular direction?
So that's quite a difficult question, because I think the difference between one of the differences, and we'll unpick more, I'm sure, but one of the differences between Speer's memoir and Philby's is that everybody is in agreement that Nazism is not a cause worth fighting for. Everybody agrees that the Nazis are beyond the pale, right? So in fact, the kind of positioning of the outside world is relatively straightforward, right? Bad Nazis, and here's Speer, he's a good one who helps us get insight. What's more complicated with the Philby memoir is that views about the treachery kind of change depending on what decade you're in, and also depending on your political persuasion. So, for example, here's a really good example. The introduction to the book is written by the novelist Graham Greene, who was friends with Philby during the war. They worked together at Section 5, and Philby and Greene remained friends. Greene was actually really good friends with John Cancross as well. So he writes a very sympathetic foreword. So Graham Greene says in his foreword that opens The Silent War, he has betrayed his country. Yes, perhaps he did. But who among us has not committed treason to something or someone more important than a country?
Ooh.
So that's a very prevalent idea, that the things they betrayed was a country that kind of needed humbling, and an establishment that needed, bringing down a peg or two. And both, and there's like lots of truth in the class stuff. I'm not kind of discounting it completely. I just want to make the point in the book, and, in response to, Philby's memoir, that actually there were people in this story who weren't British, who weren't members of the Reform Club. It wasn't just Philby who was betraying the peoples of Eastern and Central Europe. It was the rest of the Cambridge Five too, because Stalin's main strategic aim in the whole period that they were spying for him, his main foreign policy aim, was pushing the borders of the Soviet Union out and beyond Russia. And they were all incredibly helpful in their different ways to that project. And there's this weird strand of kind of vicious Anglocentrism in the memoir as well, where like he recounts, they have these meetings when he's in Washington, when he's in charge of liaising with the Americans on the mission to send Albanians into Albania. And like they have these ridiculous meetings where they're just having a big old laugh about how the Albanians have only just come down from the trees.
Wow.
I mean, it's quite hard to read with modern sensibilities, right? But so the point is, Philby.
This is like the faraway land of which we know little, with bells on. I mean, this is just quite shocking.
It's horrible, and that attitude is all the way through, right? So he wants to spread world communism, but let's just remember that people who aren't English can't quite handle anything. You know what I mean? But sorry, I've deviated from the original point. The original point is, there are lots of people for whom the cause that Philby and the others were fighting for was a cause that was worth it, right? So whether you take their treachery seriously or not also slightly depends on how you feel about the fact they devoted their lives to this ideology. Now, personally, I feel like it, that they were, servants to Stalin, and that they behaved absolutely appallingly, and that there was plenty they should and could have known about Stalin in the 1930s. Because this, of course, is the other thing, that they were just anti-fascist and they didn't know anything about Stalinism. Listen, we knew loads about Stalin and what was happening in Russia in the 1930s. It was during the war that all of that was kind of whitewashed as in the kind of propaganda wars to try and make Stalin kind of a more palatable ally. And then after the war, we rediscovered all his crimes as if they were all brand new. But there was plenty known in the 30s. You maybe had to go looking for it, but I would contend that if you've decided to dedicate your life to betray your country for a cause, it's slightly incumbent upon you to read a couple of newspapers about the,
About
what's
the
going on
cause.
in the country.
Yeah.
So, so I think, did Philby's memoir reshape how people felt? I think it's a bit kind of culture war-ish.
Right.
People don't let the facts get in their way of their vision about what is or isn't a justifiable cause, right? Just as Philby and the Cambridge Five didn't let the facts of communism get in the way of their decision to commit their lives to it in the 90s because they had a vision of utopia. I think subsequently to the Cambridge Five's unmasking, I don't think people who want to believe in them as principled ideologues let the facts of what they actually did get in the way of that vision.
Interesting. Now, where does this leave us with, the whole question of, using memoirs as historians, because, there's such, what I'm writing at the moment, it's lovely to have those accounts of people that were there and were in the room and can describe, the sweaty brows and, that so-and-so had bad breath or whatever it is. All that stuff is brilliant material, and you desperately want to bring it into your own narrative. It has an innate kind of validity to it because that person was in the room, right? And yet there are inherent problems, aren't there? Because there's no corroboration, because it could be written down 30 years after the event. There's all sorts of, memory is a weird thing. So even with the best will in the world, I've had this from doing oral history with the best will in the world and someone not actually trying to mislead you. Memory is a weird kind of pudding stone of memory and other people's memories, and your brain fills the gaps in between. So memory itself is a very weird thing. So trying to navigate all of that, where does it leave us in terms of using memoir material, do you think?
I think it's really difficult. I think in one sense it's made easier by knowing that Philby's a professional liar, right? So that you have to approach it with absolute skepticism right from the get-go and actually try and corroborate what you can where you can. So Hugh Trevor Roper, who worked with Philby during the war, the very respected historian, he basically said most of what Philby says about British intelligence, when he's writing about British intelligence, is kind of close enough to the truth. And actually, as with all these things, when these books are written with a specific purpose in mind, like Philby's, which is kind of a propaganda purpose, a rewriting purpose, the more Philby knows, because this is his, bread and butter, that the closer to the truth you are, the more convincing your narrative is, right? So a lot of it. So, and so Anthony Blunt left an unpublished memoir, and John Cairncross wrote a memoir, and they're equally full of lies and omissions. So I think it's absolutely absurd not to use them because, as you say, they're in the room, but you have to be so cautious and double check where you can, and where you can't, make sure that you put, you and I are quite scrupulous, I think. Because sometimes the temptation is to just, because if you're writing narrative history, and your histories are so brilliant, Roger, but because you want to keep the movement of the text, you want to keep the words flowing, you want to draw people through the story and as a sort of in a way that looks easy and feels easy to read. So that means that the temptation to use the sexy bits of the memoir that kind of put you in the room where it happens without any qualifications is like really strong. And I think some historians maybe give in to that temptation a little too easily. What do you think?
Yeah, I do, and I mean, I did a book years ago called "Killing Hitler," which was now, shockingly 20 years ago, and I had there's a paragraph there's a chapter in that on Speer, and looking back now, if I was to rewrite that now, I would be much harder on Speer because the whole narrative around Speer has shifted massively in the last 20 years. So I tried to be kind of objective. I tried to take, what he was saying that was relevant to that book at face value, and in a sense be fair to it, but at the same time a bit objective and to, to be critical when necessary. But if I rewrote that now, I'd write it completely differently. So it is difficult because, like you say, I mean, it's so seductive. It's, you know, you've got someone in the room, and especially when they're well written and sort of
Yeah.
erudite, and, you know, they contain all these sort of pen portraits, and they're kind of fun. I mean, I wouldn't say Speer's necessarily fun, but it's certainly a well written book. So it's tremendously seductive to you know, default to that. And two generations of historians have done it with Speer. I think we're now much more circumspect about him, but I still would say he's got a use. You know, where if you know, you read his book, and in terms of his pen portraits about senior Nazi figures, for example, his description of events is really good. I think you just have to be aware that he has this tendency, as we now fully appreciate, to essentially whitewash himself. So as long as, you know, he's not making himself look good in the process, then you can probably take what he's saying at face value. It's worth it. You know, it's worth a punt. Give it a try.
I think that's often quite a good starting point, isn't it? So there's other memoirs that I've used, like the memoirs of a KGB guy called Suda Platov, and, like, you know,
Also
when
fairly
he's not,
unreliable memoir. Yeah.
yeah, but only when he's not talking about himself. When
Mm.
he's talking about other people, he tends to be quite reliable. So I think that's also quite a good kind of shorthand when
Yeah.
you're approaching it, is to think, well, if he's talking about himself, it's useful because that's the construction that he's creating, and that's a useful part of the jigsaw puzzle, right? But it's a construction. When he's talking about other people, there's less at stake for him to be constructing, I guess. Yeah, I do think it's really interesting. And I wanted to say as well that I was reading through the reviews of Philby's book when it came out, and it was really interesting because everybody talks about how beautifully written it is. Absolutely gorgeous. I mean, it's full of these, like, sort of little ironies. It's it's sort of ravishing, really, and
Seductive in many
seductive.
ways.
And then so the Guardian review is this is sort of speaks to what I was saying a bit earlier about the sort of where you stand makes a difference. So the Guardian sort of says it's addictive and exasperating, and like basically describes it as a puzzle, and you have to try and work out what's true and what's not, but isn't it great fun, and it's also stylish and blah blah blah, wonderful. And then the Sunday Times review basically says it's like getting airsick, you know. One bowls along and suddenly there's a series of sickening lurches. And he says it's like reading the confessions of a fox, sympathizing with the hunted creature on one page, winded with the hounds panting after him, and on the next reading of a massacre in the hen roost. And that is exactly what it's like reading it. It's exactly what it's like reading it, because he's very good at sort of, you know, kind of raffish self-deprecation, and then the sort of one line that dismisses an entire, you know, people. So yeah, which I think is fascinating. So the memoirs are flawed and constructed by the person who's, you know, in Philby's case, it's a construction by him and by the KGB, and part of it is quite actually mischief making. It's trying to kind of cause problems between American and British intelligence and sort of muddy the water and whatever. And then it's a construction in the minds of the people reading it, depending on where they're standing and what they want from it. So, you know, the kind of multi-layers at which you're trying to work to kind of try and pass out what bits are interesting and what bits are usable is just, I mean, it's a fascinating, it's an absolutely fascinating exercise. And I found a few more bits and pieces where in the memoir, where I kind of thought, this is Philby playing a game on me. And it felt a bit personal. He's playing a game here, but I'm wise to it. But then I'm also, I think, very clear that he's a very fucking slippery character, and I suspect there's an awful lot in there that I'm not wise to, and he's played with me as well. So yeah, it's fascinating. Do you feel like, where do you, in terms of your human response to the Speer of the book, where do you, not thinking about it as a historian but as a kind of human, how do you feel reading it? Sorry, Roger. I know you don't like. You love questions about how you feel about shit because you're.
Yeah, I'm all about the feels. Yeah, no, I mean he does portray himself. He portrays himself really as a sort of a technocrat, as someone who, in a way, sort of made a pact with the devil, for his own advancement. He was seduced by the whole, in the same way as like Leni Riefenstahl was, although she was part seducer as well. But of course, that's it's one of the great get outs from that period, of course, isn't it? And then later in life, he portrays himself as and again, like at Nuremberg. So it's like he sort of stands there and says, well, I was sort of sucked into all this world. And he's constantly saying, well, I'm kind of like you, I'm educated, I'm urbane, and all of that, and that comes across. So he is kind of sympathetic the way he comes across to the reader in that book. You do have, in the back of your mind, he's a Nazi and all the rest of it, but he still comes across as sympathetic and crucially convincing.
We've talked a lot about this issue of Germany as a specific place that's kind of, intelligent and cultured and beautiful, being seduced by this terrible ideology and this ridiculous man. So it sounds like it almost sort of encapsulates that in one package, that whole kind of endless conundrum that you as a historian pick over and over and over is kind of summed up by that book, really.
Yeah, by that man. I mean, exactly. So as I said, whether by accident or design, he fell into that role. He was that guy, and in a sense that explains his remarkable success and his prominence after his release from prison and after the release of this memoir. It's not that a generation of historians and commentators wanted to rehabilitate Nazism. They didn't, but he kind of gave an answer to how Nazism came about and was as successful as it was, because he was the poster boy for that seduction. So I think he played that role very well.
But he gave a very specific answer, though, and also, I mean, it's sort of apt, isn't it, that it ends up being a lying answer, a mendacious answer. It's not the real answer at all, and that's almost kind of, more apt than if it had actually been a genuine piece of writing where he genuinely reckoned with his own soul.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the thing. It's quite hard to sort of pass this stuff in a way that I think he does create his own narrative. I mean, the extent to which, if we could stand him in front of us now and sort of, cross-examine him and say, well, how much did you make up? Were you conscious of making stuff up? I think he definitely was. But I struggle with the idea of just writing off everything he said as being calculated and deliberately mendacious. Because I don't think it is.
So he believes it.
Yeah, I think to some extent he explains to himself, like we all do. You have a narrative of yourself that is a created, curated thing. It may or may not coincide with the truth as others might see it. At various points. At some points in your life, it might be very close to the truth. At other points, it won't. So, I mean, this is something I saw. I did a book where I did a lot of oral history. I interviewed about sort of 40 Berliners of the wartime generation for Berlin at War. And you realize when you go and do those interviews, for example, that the first, 20 minutes, half an hour, they tell you their curated narrative. This is who I am. This is what happened to me. And it's a very brief thing, or relatively brief. And it's the story that they've been telling themselves and anyone that will listen for the last 50 years, right? When you go into the process of the interview, which is the following 3 or 4 hours, then your job is really to try and pick that apart as best you can. And to wind them back so that they actually start to question it themselves. And very often a different narrative arrives or emerges from the prepared one that they start with. And I think, in a sense, Speer is giving us a sort of a long form of that prepared narrative, that curated narrative. And it's not that it's not necessarily mendacious. I wouldn't say that all those people that I spoke to were deliberately lying to me. I think I think the memory can play tricks on you, and I think it can fill the gaps to make sense of the narrative. I think that's a natural thing. I'm not saying that's what Speer does, but to some extent, I think he probably is. He is also constructing a narrative that is self-exculpatory and self-justificatory and all the rest of it. But I think I just balk a little bit at the sort of blanket rejection.
I think maybe that's the key difference between the two documents, because Philby is, one of his defining characteristics is his egocentric belief that he's cleverer than everybody else, and the contempt with which he holds other people. And I think he is holding the readers in some level of contempt and writing a story to further fuck with us, if you excuse the language. That's what he's attempting to do. And actually what's quite funny is the compare and contrast with like John Cairncross's memoir, which adheres much more to what you're talking about. It's a kind of self-exculpatory, and like it's an extraordinarily weird document where he basically is quite clearly, unless it's a very clever triple bluff, he's very clearly lying to himself as much as he's lying to everybody else, and he has a sort of image of himself that doesn't tally with the reality. So I found so in the memoir he's quite charming, he's quite sort of debonair, and then you kind of go in, you find accounts of women who meet him, and he's really a bit kind of creepy and weird, right? So there's this with Cairncross, it's much more what you're talking about, a sort of an image of himself that he's creating partly for his own self-preservation. Whereas I think with Philby, we're much more in the territory of he's just trying to mess with our minds.
Yeah. Well, that's how he like you said, there are layers and layers of this stuff, and we do have to navigate it as best we can. Sometimes, with positive results, and sometimes not. We are all doing our best, but that's the nature of the beast, and that's why it's fascinating, right? It's why it's fascinating what we do.
That is true. So when I started out as a baby journalist on the Times, and I was on the business desk, and one of the very senior journalists who I was completely terrified of gave me a piece of advice that I applied to my journalism, and I subsequently apply to reading certainly memoirs in the intelligence field. And he said to me, whenever you're talking to someone about anything in this line of work, just keep saying to yourself, why is this bastard lying to me?
This is the Paxman line, isn't it? Why is this lying bastard lying to me?
So thanks to Martin Waller, I 30 years later I approached Philby with the due degree of caution. So when you're writing your memoir, Roger Moorhouse, how are you going to lie about yourself?
completely like a fiend. I'm going to be very debonair, of course. I'm going to be very debonair and stylish. All those
things. That a lie?
And then I'll leave it to everyone else to say, he wasn't like that at all. Actually, it was quite weird.
Yeah. I'm going to be elegant in mine. I'm going to be like one of those wafting women who just
You're
elegantly
going to waft around. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think that's fine. That's within our gift, when we come to write our memoirs. I think it's entirely fair.
All right. Well, on that note, Roger Moorhouse, thank you so much.
Wonderful. That was great.
Links to the books below. Do go out and read them. Let us know what you think if you've read them. And as ever,
any other dodgy memoirs.
Oh yeah, tell us your favourite dodgy memoir. What's your favourite dodgy memoir? So comment below and like and subscribe and all that jazz, and we'll see you next time.